大家好，这里是第5届国际公共艺术奖西中南亚板块的线上论坛部分。我是上海大学上海美术学院的张雨洁。首先，请允许我代表主办方介绍一下参与本次论坛的与会嘉宾。第一位是来自巴基斯坦的雅齐德·阿纳尼。Hi, Yazid. Hello.
Hi.
Very welcome. 雅齐德呢是巴勒斯坦伊尔萨特大学建筑系城市规划与景观设计专业的副教授。他在2010年到2012年期间呢，担任巴勒斯坦国际艺术学院学术委员会主席。他目前还是拉巴拉市 AMQ 基金会的公共项目主管。第二位我要介绍的是我们的 IPA 研究员Eva 莱米斯尔。 Hello Eva.
Hello.
Eva 是孟买艺术管理机构什么是艺术的创始人和总监。他曾为威尼斯双年展、高知双年展、上海双年展、孟加拉国达卡尔艺术峰会策划展览。第三位是我们的艺术家，来自印度德里的阿西姆瓦奇夫。Hello, Asim.
Hi.
Hello. 他毕业于德里的规划与建筑学院，曾担任电影、电视艺术总监。他的作品呢，尝试跨界于建筑、艺术和设计领域，并常常与当代城市公共空间的干预有密切的关系。他也是本次西中南亚优秀作品 Loy 的创作者。第四位呢是舒鲁克哈布。Hello Harb. Hi. 哈布呢是一位艺术家、电影制片人兼作家。他的电视作品《白象》荣获了2018年法国真实电影节最佳短片奖，并入围了2019年汉堡国际短片节。是一位非常优秀的电影制作人。接下来呢，我将会把这个主持的权利呢交给Yazid，由他来带领大家进行讨论。Hi Yazid, now is your turn.
Thank you, Yuji. And hello all. I hope you excuse my hoarse voice. I assure you it's not COVID. So I won't be infecting anyone online. I hope so. So please bear with me the unclarity of my words at some moments. So it goes up and down. So I have to control it somehow during the awards ceremony. So the good thing is that I'll be moderating this session, and the majority of the talking will be done by my colleagues. Okay, I want to start by thanking the IAPA for persisting on moving on with the awards ceremony within these tough times. And of course, I want to welcome all these wonderful people partaking in this session. And I hope our conversation will be enriching and relevant to the contemporary discourse on public art. A quick roadmap for this session. We will start with the Delhi-based artist Asim Waqif, one of the nominees for the International Award of Public Art, who will be talking about his project Loy, which is a Daga Puja Pandal. I hope I pronounce it correctly, Asim, which is a tent for housing the deity of the Hindu goddess Daraga. This will be then followed by an intervention by Yves Lemesle, who was one of the researchers and nominators of public art projects to the IAPA. Yves will be elaborating on her research findings by contextualizing Asim's project within the plethora of other public art projects that she examined. And finally, I will pose some questions to both Asim and Yves, together with our guest artist and writer, Shuruq Harb. We will be definitely exploring public art through some questions that emerged while the jury was discussing and evaluating and debating relevant projects for this award. I'll finish right here, and I'll give the floor to Asim to talk for 10 minutes about his nominated project, Loy. Please, Asim.
Thank you so much, Yazid. So basically, this project had a really large team, and it was commissioned by a local resident association in Calcutta, which is one of the largest cities in India. The collaboration was a really important part of the project. When working on large projects, I have become really keen to sort of try to create a situation where um, um, a set of skilled people come together and they provided the right relevant resources for their craft or for their skill set. And then when they start working together, I like to I like to encourage people to work in each other's field. So like many of my projects, actually, initially I mean, Durga Puja itself is actually traditionally, I mean, it has a history of about 300 or 400 years, but in the last 50 years, it has been transforming from a more traditional, vernacular kind of a craft-based project to more and more abstract and sometimes even really bizarre kind of interpretation of what a religious pavilion should be like. So actually, the clients were really open about what I could do. And in some ways, actually, it is almost like a requirement to do something novel, something new for the pandal itself. This was my site. So it's actually quite a low-income neighborhood in Calcutta with small houses, and you need to go through small roads to actually get to this place. This is traditionally not the neighborhood that is associated with a very large-scale puja. But perhaps that is one of the reasons actually that somebody like me could, participate in the project. And like many of my projects, I actually started with very intense research about the place and about different crafts in and around Calcutta. This is a neighborhood called Kumartuli in Calcutta, which has like a long history of idol making using straw and clay, but also looking at other things like wooden board building. And also I'm particularly interested in cane and bamboo. And actually cane and bamboo is used extensively in Durga Puja traditionally, but more often than not, the structural part is made out of bamboo, and then it is kind of decorated and hidden away. So you don't really see the bamboo that much in the usual Durga Puja that happens in Calcutta. Then we had a long series of model making and maquette making in my studio in Delhi. So we would keep going back to Calcutta and coming back to Delhi, doing research in Calcutta and coming back to Delhi. And at this time, I had a smaller team. One of the architects, Shantanu, was one of my he was my right-hand man on the project. And together we started developing different kind of possibilities that we would like to play with. So in some way, I was looking at more of a kind of an organic form to this sort of the pandal itself. But at the same time, I wanted to integrate a really sort of an interactive game environment within the space. So we started developing also interactive electronic systems. So starting first from very hand-soldered PCBs to understand what we wanted and whether they worked or not, and then going more and more sophisticated and developing, so we had about 3 or 4 stages of different PCBs that we manufactured for the project itself. The work on the site itself started with a puja, with a prayer, which is what the point of the whole pavilion is actually. And we started about 2.5 to 3 months before the opening of the festival. Initially, I asked my contractor to make a kind of a roof. Actually, the thing is that the construction phase of the project was during the monsoons when it rained a lot, especially in Calcutta. So we needed to have a roof over our heads to make whatever we were making. And I felt that if we were going to make a roof or a structure to house something, then it was actually more interesting to incorporate that roof in the final project itself. So this was more just kind of defining what kind of a form I wanted for the roof, which is inspired by temple architecture in Bengal, and letting them do it their way, not supervising it too much in terms of how they actually make it. Then once they had made the structure, Shantanu and I, we started introducing a much more chaotic form into this place. And the workers themselves and the supervisor were much more used to a regular form. So initially we had to be very particular about telling them about each and every piece of bamboo that we wanted to put and how we wanted to put it. But as in how things progressed and the workers got more comfortable with the kind of form we wanted, we actually gave them a lot of leeway, and we actually withdrew from the process to let them do it, which was a little complicated because people expect a very strong hierarchy and expect very specific instructions. So there was a lot of reluctance at one point about for the workers. They didn't want to take the creative decision, or at least the responsibility of taking the creative decision. But I told them that basically, if we make a mistake, we can always undo it, or we can try something else. But it was important for them to try. So we're also trying to introduce a lot of information and research on bamboo and cane to these workers who have been working on it traditionally. So they don't have that theoretical or sort of a detailed documentation of how other people have been working. They've been working in their own way really well. So trying to introduce them to those things and trying different kinds of processes. And then slowly, I mean, out of the things that we tried, maybe about 40% of them we actually discarded. We did not use by the end. But it was important to try those things so that we were able to reach where we did eventually. And we had a lot of complex electronic sort of a system inside it as well, where basically, well, there were a couple of issues. The thing is that when visitors come, sometimes there are thousands of people who line up to come in. But at other times, there are only like 10 people or maybe nobody. So we wanted a system that was kind of a learning system. Depending on how many people are inside the space, it's behaved differently. So few people could trigger the sensors very easily. While if there was a large group, we didn't want it to get cacophonic. So the larger group had to work much harder to trigger those same sensors. And we were using like things like machine learning and LiDAR sensors, weight sensors, touch sensors, shadow sensors, which would then trigger mechanical or electronic components, which were designed to sound more like musical instruments, or even like a natural environment, like crickets in a field or frogs, that kind of a thing. And coincidentally, we started growing things in the pavilion. Actually, most of my workers were taking a few days off to go back to their villages to plant paddy and other things, because it was the growing season at that time. So what I told them is to get some seeds back. And the thing is that our site was quite a waterlogged area, and it was kind of messy. And we needed to dress the ground in some way. So instead of dressing the ground with something artificial, we actually planted a lot of different things, including, well, later actually we also got into, once we started getting into planting, then we started looking at plants that are relevant to the prayer and the ritual. And there was one particular prayer called the Navpatrika Puja, where 9 different plants are used during the puja. So then we introduced those plants. One of them was lotus. And for lotus, you need a pond, but then we had lots of mosquitoes as well. So then we put fish in the pond, and some other places we started growing mushrooms. So it was kind of a very organic, open-ended project where nothing was really not allowed. We were just trying to see what all could be, possibly done. I also worked with a Vietnamese origami artist for the idol itself. So the idol is made out of paper, actually folded paper. And yeah, I mean, so this is what we finally made. And it was quite an interesting project for me. Initially, the residents themselves were quite nervous because the bamboo and cane is very raw in this project. They expected a very decorated, even glittery sort of that is the expectation. But by the end of it, with the lighting and the interactive elements, actually it worked out really well, and the residents were like really happy, and we got very good feedback from people as well. This is part of the ceiling, some basket making techniques which I kind of made more into architectural forms. And actually, the thing at the back, which is the white, is actually a white plastic which is on the roof, which is what was protecting us from the rain. Also, with all the electronics, we had to be a little careful about moisture. So that's about it for my presentation, I think.
Thank you, Asim. Probably there would be many questions from the audience to you at the end of the session. So perhaps now we can move to Eve. Eve, you have 10 minutes to unpack Asim's project within the bigger research that you've done and the nominated projects that you presented to the IAPA. Eve, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Yazid, and hi, everyone. So I've been part of the IPA since 2015. And before I speak about Asim's project that we've just seen, I just wanted to speak about my experience as a researcher and look at the other projects I had nominated as well. So over the years, my research has been mostly centered on South Asia because that's where I live. And I've probably nominated close to 50 projects over the years in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Afghanistan, etc. So mostly that region. And this year, I also extended the research to West and Central Asia a little more with projects in Palestine and Lebanon that I'm going to show. And so let me start with maybe sharing my screen and briefly showing like images of these projects. Go so much in detail. I just wanted to show the variety of projects and the different locations, etc., from architectural intervention with natural material to murals. Sorry, I think this is being cut. That's an interesting project of a mural in Pakistan made by artists from Pakistan and India together, which is difficult to achieve. I mean, for people just to be able to cross the border is not easy. This is another walking performance in Pakistan. That's a project, also performance-based project in Bangalore. This is a project in Lebanon with salt bricks. I'm going to speak a bit about. This is another one in Palestine, in an old abandoned water body by a Turkish artist. This is in India, a sculpture part in an old fort. So this is an installation by Richard Long, but there are many artists who've been part of this project. And this is Asim's project, as we've seen. So I'll just stop sharing. I just wanted to show you a bit of the diversity of the projects. When we were preparing the session with Yazid, so Yazid, you asked me what these projects have in common. And it was actually the first time I was trying to find common grounds between the different projects about their extended geography, which is what in the IPA we all work on specific geographical areas. I realized I had never thought of while nominating the similarities between projects. So that was quite an interesting question because usually the selection is made by according to the relevance of the project in its particular context. And that's maybe why I tend to nominate more projects in South Asia where I live, because I have a better understanding of the local social, political, and historical context. So all these projects I've shown you, as you've seen, are very different in medium, in forms. They range from installation to performance to architectural interventions, craft, storytelling, movement, murals, etc. Some projects are permanent, some lasted for a year, some were very short performances of a couple of hours. So coming back to the similarities, so I think they're all deeply rooted in their local context, either because they hold a strong political engagement or because they foster collaborations with local crafts and traditions, or they involve local or indigenous communities, or they are based on forgotten histories. For example, many of these projects foster collaboration with a sense of shared creativity or co-creation, which is very Asim's projects that we've just seen. So I found most of these projects create circumstances for participatory public art practices. And in few of them, the role of the artist could be defined as a mediator or a catalyst, allowing others to own the project. They challenge hierarchies between arts and crafts, artisan and artist, inside and outside, public and private. I also noticed looking at them again that many of the projects raise environmental and sustainability questions. And most of them also look at the notion of territory, memory, again, deeply rooted in their context, helping communities to reclaim or to reactivate public spaces or abandoned grounds. Again, we've seen that in Asim's project, and that allows to highlight their particular cultural contexts. And then many projects highlight the notion of construction, destruction, of cycle, of repetition of history as well. It's like they bring invisible layers to the surface and anchor the past into the present. So coming now to Asim's project in particular, first of all, I would like to remind that in India, it's very difficult to access public space for contemporary art and contemporary public art projects. It's difficult to get permissions for artists to realize their projects in most of Indian large cities. So public art is not at all in the priorities of the government. The government funding for public art is inexistent. And since private foundations cannot access and get permissions for public art, then they have very, like almost no budgets for that as well. So it's kind of a cycle, like a circle. And it's very difficult for artists to find supporting organizations or supporting funding bodies to realize the projects. So when Asim told me about his project in Kolkata, I found this collaboration between him and the local association of the Durga Puja absolutely fascinating, because religious festivals in India are for sure one of the biggest forms of popular art and culture. And in these festivals, I mean, we've seen, Asim has shown images, so there are like ample space for traditional art forms, giant sculptures, architectural pavilions for the idols, for the gods, performing arts, music, dance, etc. The crowds are billions of people attending the festival, and the ceremonies are huge. So I was very impressed that Asim found a way to enter that space and to bring contemporary art in such a popular and crowded traditional context. So I knew of Asim's bamboo architectural interventions since more than 15 years. I've been following his work. And of course, I was very impressed by the scale of Floy, which is probably one of the largest intervention is made in terms of size. And when I started researching more on the project, I was very impressed by the crossover between art, architecture, and design, and also the process of collaboration. So I was just speaking about the co-creation aspect. And I think, I mean, we find it in many of the projects I've nominated, but in Asim's projects, it's taking another level because I find the collaborative effort between all the participants being like a co-elevation, you know, where everyone equally contributes to the creative act and get empowered by it. So, and of course, the project is very relevant in, you know, because it speaks about concerns of ecology, anthropology, vernacular systems. And it is for me one of the most brilliant public art projects I've been given to see in India. So yeah, that's about it for my my thoughts and feedback.
Thank you so much, Eve. It's very interesting to sort of see the different projects that you've been examining. I think now we go for more broader questions on the practice of public art today, and maybe connecting all these projects with the broader questions on public art. So I'll start with Shuruq, maybe followed afterwards with Asim and Eve. So during our several jury sessions at the IAPA back in 2019, many conversation emerged concerning the fine line between artists' public art interventions in the social fabric of our societies and our urban spaces, and also similar practices of social and political activists who does not necessarily come from an art background or an academic background that relates to art. So Shuruq, from your practice and experience, can you please tell us how do you approach this notion in your practice, this division between public intervention that looks artistic, done by artists, and that of political and social activists?
I think I can, honestly, I was thinking about this more in relation to, I mean, things that emerge from my own practice as an artist and also as a curator, but just generally from what I see, you know, around me. And I always think about this, you know, I want to kind of like give a very specific example, because I think we live in a time when we all feel that food is such an important thing that we need to investigate, regardless of whether we are artists or not. Just the whole idea that, you know, agriculture and food has been so far removed from our lives. And so there's been a lot of initiatives that have tried to work either on, you know, some kind of urban gardens, you know, cultivate that within their own spaces. And certainly I did when I was the director of Makan Art Space in Amman. But also there's been multiple youth initiatives, I would say, here in Palestine that have, you know, simply began these kind of like plastic house initiatives or rooftop gardens. And so, I mean, I'm trying to bring this simple example of gardens and agriculture in this sense. And then I started to think, well, because there's a lot of criticism sometimes about, well, you know, when an art space does this, well, this is not art. Or how do you say that farming is part of your practice? Because a lot of people perceive these gestures as just simply performative. And sometimes they are, because literally the thing the space is, you know, making is not enough to really sustain or make a dent in someone's life. But then I also always ask, what happens when you ask, why does it matter whether we think about this as art or not? And I think that's always a central thing. So if an artistic space or an intervention of some sort uses this as a platform to instigate a conversation, or provoke people to reflect on their own eating habits, their consumption habits. I realize also that you can also do this outside of an art space, but this is what an art space has decided to do. For me, this is interesting. But when I narrowed it down further, because I was trying to think about an example that is, you know, that I've been following for the last few years. And I was just thinking about an initiative by these two young farmers who also happen to be young dancers that are part of a traditional Dabke group here in Palestine called Al-Funun. So they graduated from university and they realized that, okay, either they're going to work in an NGO or they're going to work for someone. So the kinds of work options and labor available, or go work, you know, try to get a permit and go work in Israeli settlements, that kind of labor, this kind of work is not satisfying, and it doesn't give them independence and agency over their life. So what they decided to do is they took, you know, they got a few dunams from their village that were not active, they were not cultivating. This is outside of Ramallah, on the west end of Ramallah. And they decided to do, a plastic house, and then they also decided to farm, these inactive lands from the village. And they called the initiative Ard al-Yas, which translates to the land of desperation, which for me is a very ironic title for such an initiative, because it implies something maybe sad, but they are actually trying to make this into something very empowering. And they just started to cultivate this and bring on more youth from the village, and they sell their products. Their products are organic. And for us Palestinians, this is very important because we're trying to not depend on Israeli vegetables and fruits. But it's interesting when you listen to them talk about the initiative. So they feel that to quote one of them, when they are in the land, they don't separate the presence of their body as a dancer from their presence of their body as a farmer. And similarly on stage, they don't separate the presence of the body as a farmer from the presence of the body as a dancer. So what I found very interesting here is that they're not claiming that this initiative of theirs is an artistic one. It's not an art project. But as you watch videos of them farming, you see how they've started to choreograph new kinds of dance moves, just spontaneously, just expressing themselves. And I think this is really, really interesting because traditional dance, Palestinian dance, also emerges from the movements of farmers, in the land. So I thought this was like such a beautiful, nice semiosis of the relationship of the two. And I think a lot of times, I want to use this example, because a lot of times we sometimes look at social and political initiatives and we become very cynical because we perceive them as being performative, or we're asking a farm to become a discursive artistic project or speak about itself in a discursive way, when actually what it needs to do is actually feed us, right? And to perform as a pathway to independence and agency and self-sustainability. And so I really like this example because there's a semiosis of past, presence, activism, the body as a dance, the body as it performs as a farmer. I know it's a long answer, but I hope it gives you a clue into what I was thinking.
Thank you so much, Shuruq. So many things came to my mind. It's also about the way we label things. And I think it's the approach towards framing things as artistic, as a holistic project, rather than looking at the artistic experience and moments of artistic intervention in these bigger frames. So thank you so much, Shuruq. I don't know if Asim and Eve, you want to elaborate on this question before moving to the other questions?
Yeah, I find actually, I have done some social and political activism as well. But I think one kind of, the way usually activism happens is that it tends to be kind of didactic, and also it tends to take an extreme point of view to sort of normalize or rather oppose what it's trying to work against. And in that sense, I find that because it is kind of critical of people's lifestyles or something, sometimes people get a bit too defensive and automatically build a wall to protect themselves from that discourse. While I find actually that in the artistic domain, the potential of being ambiguous, potential of being frivolous even, also humorous about things, allows actually these questions or these issues to perhaps be ingrained into the viewer without a very concerted, very obvious, overt process. And then I find that when that question comes from within the viewer, and then he tries to answer it, and the answer is not obvious, the answer is something that the person has to think about or discuss with people, that kind of a space actually has more potential in terms of changing people's thoughts or perceptions, rather than a very direct thing, this is a bad way to do things or that is a good way to do things. So in that sense, I find, not everywhere, but at least in some situations, the artistic process actually has a lot of potential for activism, without, again, defining that boundary, that what is activism and what is art. Because again, if you look at something as only art, it is not, sometimes it's not supposed to talk, or it is not supposed to talk about very serious, real world problems. So I like to be on that edge, where you're not able to really place it in either space. And also I like to keep the discourse also a bit ambiguous in terms of what I'm trying to say. So the viewer themselves has to think of the questions and answers.
Eve, do you have something to say regarding this issue?
Yeah, so as Asim was saying, or I think there are definitely intersections between art and activism. On one hand, like there are many instances where art has an activism component, and activism, as Shuruq was, her example is beautiful, showing that activism can also be an agent for cultural production. In a way. So, and public art, I think, is at the intersection between three social spheres, like urban space, art, and social components, social movements. And that's what we're also looking at the IPA, which is the idea of placemaking. And most of the projects we are nominating and when we do the case studies are looking at how that relationship really between the place and the community and the art project. So definitely, sorry, public art can be, can address contemporary urban transformations as well as social movements, etc. I think that's very between both.
Thank you, Eve. I think we're very close to the end of the session when I was looking at the time. So we have maybe another 4 minutes. And I don't think that there's a space for another question. But then, Asim, my question to you is this a permanent structure? And my question is, if it's not, is there a sort of recycling for the material by the community to the bamboo structure? And can you tell us more about how this really sort of sways between permanence and ephemeral relationship?
This is a completely temporary project. Actually, it was open to the public only for 10 days. That's it. It took me about 8 months of preparation to work on the project. 3 months of that was on site, but it was open to the public only for 10 days. And after that, most of the stuff was resold in the secondary market. Most of the bamboo, cane, all the construction materials. We had a floor made out of timber, which went into the scaffolding industry. And a lot of the electronics and components, they've been used for other projects after that. So, of course, I wouldn't say that there was no waste at all. There was some wastage. But at the same time, we tried our best to minimize the ecological impact. And also, it's also a revenue thing, in some way, because for example, some things were borrowed for the project. Instead of buying something for a project and then not using it, we just kind of borrowed it, and then, and whatever could be resold was resold for really cheap, but still,
Final question, maybe to Shuruq. Shuruq, from your practices, you've conducted several public art interventions in Palestine and also in Jordan. My question is the dialogue that happens between the publicness of what you do, whether it's performative or an intervention and that has some visuals that remains as a stain on the urban space and urban fabric. But how is this dialogue? What kind of dialogue is happening between artists their art project and the governmental body, whether it's a municipality or the authority that is regulating that space?
I mean, with a lot of things, my interventions or the things that I did in public space were either ephemeral or they were not intended to stay. They created an experience rather than a monument of some sorts. But in the one instance that I did create, quite a huge installation called All the Names, it was a very big sign, and it was critiquing how the municipality renamed the streets of Ramallah. And they had commissioned me to do the work. The work disappeared one day they never told me. And it was very surprising that something that's about 8 meters would just simply disappear and never to be found again. But for me, that was such an interesting experience in and of itself. I was very worried because the material that we used was aluminum, that maybe someone would steal it and reuse it and repurpose it, which actually often happens with street signs in Ramallah. But for me, the fact that the municipality did it was interesting because they really didn't like it. You know, they were very upset about kind of how it brought to the surface that conversation and the critique around the renaming of the streets and the urban planning of the city. But it was one of the few instances where I felt that I communicated with the city officially, materially. And then I also got a very material response. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Shuruq. There's so many interesting stuff that we can go on talking about, but I think our 45 minutes are over. So thank you all for enriching the conversation. And I handed it over now to the organizers.